one of the challenges that the continent in South Africa is experiencing right now is the fact that there are a whole lot of workers, but not enough jobs for them in the economy. And also, there are a whole lot of jobs in the economy, but there's not sufficient skills from the workers that require them. So I'm talking about the Reskilling Revolution, spearheaded by the World Economic Forum, which positions education at the core of the economic recovery by updating teaching and education systems to effectively prepare today's students for tomorrow's economy and society. So the education sector needs to look at new approaches to competitiveness, to deploy education and also skills for tomorrow's workforce. The sector also needs to build a new pro-worker and pro-business agenda for jobs and integrate equality and inclusion into this new economy. So this is a conversation we're about to have, and let's meet the panelists that I'm going to have it with.
The panelists are Professor Malcolm McIver, CEO, TAG West Africa, University of Lancaster, Ghana. Professor Adam Habib, Director, SOAS University, London. Professor Letlokwa Mpedi, Vice-Chancellor and Principal, University of Johannesburg. And Dr. Marwa Hadar, Vice President, Finance and Strategy at Blue Monsoon Capital.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for joining us at the Future of Education Summit. I suppose class is officially now in session, given that this is the first panel discussion that will be kicking off at the summit this year. I'd actually like to first ask all of you, particularly the educators, just what the current state of education as you see it right now is. Just given the fact that we're coming from 2022, which was the first full year that the education system and universities and schools and the like could continue as is without any disruptions from the COVID-19 lockdowns. So coming from that backdrop, Prof. McIver, perhaps let me begin with you. How would you describe what the education picture is currently looking like?
Good morning, Fifi, and it's a pleasure to speak with you again. I think, if I'm being honest, what the picture currently looks like is one of catch-up. Education is very much playing catch-up. We learned some very important lessons as a result of COVID-19 and the lockdown. One of the things, for example, that we learned was that remote learning is a viable option. And I think a lot of people who are originally quite skeptical about the benefits of remote learning were converted to the benefits of it during the lockdown. But we weren't fully prepared for this, and we weren't fully prepared for the nuances of remote learning. So I think we're catching up in relation to that. In addition to that, again, one of the things that came out as a result of the lockdown and the pandemic was that industry itself is having to change its working practices. And we are having to play catch up again in terms of preparing the workforce of the future to engage with those changing working practices. So we learned some important lessons. There were some positives, believe it or not, to take out of COVID and the last couple of years, but we have a long way to go yet.
Certainly, many would describe that what we did see during the pandemic is a sort of tectonic shift in terms of the urgency and the speed that is required right now to ensure that a lot more learners are prepared for the future of work. I mean, we were talking about the fourth industrial revolution prior to going into the pandemic, and then the pandemic just accelerated things perhaps 100-fold in some corners. But Prof. Mbedi, just to you, sir, at UJ and also as you have conversations amongst your colleagues here in South Africa, what's your feel on where the education system, the tertiary education system specifically, finds itself in right now? Is it also a game of catch-up within your corridors, or are there other things that you're currently contending with?
Yes, good morning, Fifi. Thanks for having us again. Good morning to fellow panelists. Yes, I agree with what Prof. Malcolm has already indicated. There are lots of lessons. Look, when you look at the sector, South African higher education sector, one must be careful not to generalize, because different institutions of higher education experienced the COVID pandemic in a different way. If you look at the University of Johannesburg, we were more or less ready, when the pandemic hit us, because we invested a lot of resources in our online systems and so on. And as a result, we could finish the academic year on time. So from that, we said we're going to take all the positive lessons learned to take us forward. Already at the University of Johannesburg, we're talking about developing the digital twin of the bricks and mortar campus, because we have seen some of the benefits, of going online and so on. But now going back to the question you've raised, obviously, many of our students, studied under COVID circumstances. Many of them have not had enough classroom experience, and as a university, we cannot say, this is a problem and push that away. So we have to work with the students and provide enough support. One point that I would like to raise that I'm seeing, and I'm sure many of the institutions of higher education are seeing, is that many of our students, are struggling because of the economic challenges that their guardians are facing. So as institutions of higher learning, we have to dig deeper to support our students so that, they can study and do well and then complete their studies on time.
Sure. Of course, I mean, at the heart of it is the economy right now, contributing to a lot of the joblessness that we are seeing. I mean, in as much as there's a skills mismatch, there's also companies who are not in the financial position to increase their hiring, which is why I thought it was really important for us to understand where we're coming from, so that we can know where we're going to right now as we do talk about the Reskilling Revolution. Prof. Habib, give us the perspective, perhaps from a global scene. I mean, at the University of London, the SOS, the SOAS University of London. Just given the various cultures under the institution, I mean, in one of the global capitals of the world, how would you describe the current state of education, just globally, if you can just draw in that nuance to how it also compares to what you are seeing on the continent and specifically here in South Africa?
So I think a couple of things are worth saying. I think Malcolm's right. The online revolution is on. It's legitimized in a way that hasn't happened before. There were many academics that would have, pre-2018, been very skeptical about online education. I think the fact that we've all shifted to emergency remote learning is something that has been largely legitimized the online education facility. Having said that, I also think that what we've got to do is bring more nuance into the technological revolution and the teaching of learning online. I think what we are navigating towards is blended learning. Many of our students are saying to us, we think it's important we have the facility to go online, but we also want the ability to meet and interact with people in a classroom setting. And so the real debate is how to do this properly and how to bring some nuance into this. You learn in a university not simply by imbibing facts. What you learn is by interacting with people. And some of that interaction can take place online, but quite a bit has to happen face-to-face. And it's about creating the blended learning that is important. So that's the first thing that I think is important. The second thing that is useful, Fifi, you made the point that we've got a mismatch between the skill sets of our people in South Africa and the jobs that are available. But you have to also ask the question, why is it that the portfolio of South African universities, the academic portfolio, the things we teach in universities, is very similar to what we teach in the UK, in the US, and in many other parts of the world. But in South Africa, we have young people, unemployment rate is anything between 50 and 60%. And in the place like UK, it's about 5 or 6. What that suggests that it's not simply about academic portfolio. I think that that's important, but it's about the absorptive capacity of the economy. It's about the fact that companies are not growing. It's about the fact that there are power problems in South Africa. It's about infrastructure collapsing. It's frankly about the incompetence of government by not creating an enabling environment. And I think in South Africa, we're ducking that question. If we don't have the courage to say the academic portfolio is one thing, and we can talk about that in a minute, but the second is the capacity of government and the private sector the private sector to grow and government to create the enabling environment to do so. And that isn't been happening in South Africa. And that's why you've got an unemployment crisis as high as you have in South Africa, rather than what you have in other parts of the world.
Okay. So, Prof, we will continue to duck that question for a sec. I'm going to come back to you, and we'll probably get the insights from the other panelists as to what their view is there, and the split between how much is the economy and how much is the skills mismatch, and what can be done in everyone's respective portfolios. But I just want to hear from Dr. Hada first, because ma'am, in finance, you are in a position right now, in a sector right now that is actually creating jobs. I mean, if I just take a look at what is happening in South Africa, there has been quite a significant absorption rate of workers in finance, even young workers in finance, obviously not as many as could be the case if we were working in a vibrant economy, but it's happening nonetheless. And I'd just like to understand from you, from the pool that you are seeing of young workers entering finance, how would you describe their readiness coming from varsity to enter the workplace? And just, is there any gaps that you see in some of the young talent that walks through your corridors?
Thank you, Fifi, for this question. I'm delighted to be here. I will talk about the African context and myself being educated in Africa and working a lot here. I think there is a wide gap between certain, for example, countries that produce, even the term produce is not maybe accurate term here, highly skilled, for example, engineers in STEMs. And these engineers, they don't find actually good jobs opportunity, because most of our manufacturing base and our financial base has not evolved since probably the 70s. So there has been growth after the independence, but our manufacturing base, service base has not evolved to be like to create complexity in the economy. So there is some part of, let's say, 1-2% of the engineers and the graduate students that have the skills, that are very well educated, but they don't find the right jobs, because most of it they don't need such I mean important skills. Most of it is at the low technical terms, and so they try to unfortunately find opportunities abroad in Europe or in North America or in other parts of the world. The other side is there is a huge number of graduate students that are unemployable, unfortunately, because they lack the skills, and that create like this white mismatch that you talked about initially. In that sense, it's very it's a pity, because the public resources in Africa are scarce and expensive. And we have to talk also about the policy and the way governments are allocating resources in the African context. If we are creating the illusion of being educated, meaning we are producing huge number of graduate students with, I mean, they spend long years studying at university, or like 12 years of curricula, and then they are with degrees that have really no market value locally or regionally, or not to say at the global level. And yeah, so this is the, I think, where we have mismatch on the African context itself.
Mm-hmm. A wasted investment from the point of a parent who has funded that degree, and certainly from the point of the scholar who has put the time and the effort and the energy to ensure that they get that certificate to come out in an economy that doesn't actually place significant value on their qualifications. So let's get into the reskilling revolution then. Prof. McLeaver, I think I've spoken to you about this before at Future, or at previous Future of Education summits. This reskilling revolution, it's something that we were talking about way before the pandemic, but clearly something that requires a lot more urgency right now. Can we talk about the templates to follow, or that is being followed even at Lancaster, as to what the ideal reskilling model, the revolutionary reskilling model, should look like in this environment?
Thank you, Fifi, and you are absolutely right. I have spoken about this before, and I'm going to go off on my mantra very shortly. But this is not a new problem. We currently call it the skills gap. 30 years ago, we were talking about the theory-practice gap. 50 years ago, we were talking about the ivory towers of academia. So this is a long-standing problem, and we still haven't fully addressed it. One of the ways in which we are addressing it at Lancaster University, Ghana, is actually through working with industry. And this is my mantra, it has to be collaboration. For far too long, what we've had is a process that has had artificial lines of demarcation. We've had mainstream education as preparing children for mainstream education to complete all of their assessment criteria. They then go into tertiary education, and we prepare students to complete our assessment criteria, and then we hand them over to industry. And as a result of that, they are going into industry with these skills gaps. They're not being fully prepared. And we need to move away from this compartmentalization process. It's almost as if when a child starts school at the age of 5, nobody realizes that 15, 16 years later, they are going to be entering the workforce. So what we need to do is we need to have a joined up process. We need to have this joined up way of thinking and appreciate that the primary function of education is to prepare the workforce of the future. In order to do that, we need to engage with industry right at the very beginning. And this is what we are doing at Lancaster University, Ghana. We bring industry into the classroom and we take education into the workplace. So we have an extensive network of corporate partners who are all invited to come into our classrooms and to participate and to work with our students. Equally, we have an extensive program of internships. Every single one of our students gets the opportunity to have an internship with a leading industry partner. And in addition to that, in terms of preparing the curricula, at Lancaster in the UK, where our curricula are developed, they are developed in partnership with industry. So we need to have not this compartmentalization, but we need to have this synergy from day one throughout the educational process. So this transition into industry is a smooth transition.
Okay, no, agreed. So I just wanted to follow up, where exactly is day one? Because some would argue that, by the time you even get to varsity level, it's a little bit late. And that perhaps this interaction where you have got industry and the private sector just looking at education models needs to happen a lot earlier on in that value chain. So in your view, where is day one right now? And is there a case to be made for the ballpark where day one stands at this present moment in time to be shifted back to earlier in the child's learning journey?
I don't think day one is a hard and fast start line as we'd expect in a race, but I would expect industry to start collaborating with primary education. I think that's the point when we need, for many people, that's when they start to have aspirations. That's when they start to dream of being an astronaut when they grow up, or being a nurse or a doctor when they grow up. And I think that's the time when we should be looking at introducing, in phased introduction, industry into the classrooms, into the education places. But I also think we should be taking, as I said before, we should be taking the classroom out of the schools and putting that into the workplace.
Okay, got it. Prof. Mbedi and Prof. Habib, both of you mentioned the issue around the economy in South Africa at this present moment in time, not doing what it should be. Prof. Habib, perhaps maybe I'll start with you as we talk about the economy, just given the fact that you spoke so impassionately about it, drawing distinctions to the fact that you've got a similar curricula happening in London, in universities across London, with a similar curricula happening with universities across South Africa, but you don't have as wide a skills gap or a mismatch as you do in London, as you do in South Africa, just speaking to the heart of the economy. So what are you saying? Are you saying in the absence of economic growth and the kind of reforms that are needed to pick up economic activity to inform and allow hiring, that things are just going to get worse and we're just wasting our time talking about a reskilling anything?
So I'm saying two things. Think about what Malcolm just said. Malcolm said there are two issues. One is about the academic portfolio. What do we teach in the classroom, and how do we get what we teach in the classroom to align more with the kinds of jobs and skills required in the economy? I don't want to say that that's not important. It is. It's absolutely crucial that we do that. But that's only one part of the problem. It seems to me that there's another part of the problem, which is how do we organize the resource deployment? Fifi, you said, how do we enable collaboration? How do we structure our institutions to work? So let me give you an example. You can have the best portfolio in the world, but if primary and pre-primary school is not teaching people to read, write, and numeracy skills, you can't do anything at the age of 17. You've got to make sure that 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, the basic foundations of learning are happening in the way they should. And we know in South Africa, that's just not happening. We're not getting the right amount of reading skills, the right amount of writing skills, and the right amount of numeracy skills. So that's problem one. Problem two is, it seems to me, we need, in the economy we're growing into, a large number of technical skills. Now, we've handed the technical skills to create a post-secondary technical education system. That is what would have previously been known as the technicons, the further training colleges, etc. They're in a mess. They're in a true mess. And part of that is large amount of resources are going into CETAs that are managing this. Now, to be honest, the CETAs, let's be honest, is a deployment for cadres. They bloody unskilled. They have no idea what they're doing. I would restructure that, tie all of those further education training colleges to big industry, because big industry does require skill set. So SCASL needs people, the banks need people, tie them to working with those technical further training colleges to create the skill sets that they require. And they then can get a tax deduction. They get a tax deduction, and you'll save this billions of rands we spend on really badly trained cadres who know very little about education and only know how to toy-toy at a political conference. Then there's a third element we have to ask is in the university system. In the last 5 years, we shot NSFAS spending from 5 million in 2015 to 5 billion in 2015 to 47 billion in 22-23. Can anybody tell me that South African universities, particularly the bottom 11 or the bottom 15, are any better off than they were for 5 years ago? You would even say they're probably worse off. People are trying to assassinate vice chancellors at Forte. That's a shocking state of affairs. And so we need a real rethink about how we deploy resources to universities that work rather than places that are not working, to changing councils, to appointing the appropriate vice chancellors and appointing academics with the appropriate skills. And frankly, we're not having an honest conversation on that. Once we get that stuff right, then we can talk about, let's talk about the portfolio, getting the right portfolio, academic portfolio and institution. But it's like we're putting the cart before the horse here. And let's have an honest discussion about what needs to be done for the skills revolution. And that means close the CETAs down, get some skills people in there, link them up to big industry, and start spending money in institutions that work. And we're ducking all of those questions. Until we fix those, we're not going to get anywhere.
Okay. Prof. Habib, on the same page, I'm all for having a very frank and honest conversation. Let's also make it respectful to fellow stakeholders in this industry, just to respect them in terms of how we make references. And I think that, we'll certainly have a really informative one. But Prof. Mbedi, just to come to you, a lot of ideas being put on the table there by Prof. Habib in terms of fixing some of the challenges economically that are perhaps impeding the ability of institutions to move a lot quicker in coming up with an academic portfolio that will enable sufficient reskilling. I do know that in the case of the University of Johannesburg, it's a little bit different. I mean, I had a conversation with one of your colleagues about the piloting of electric buses sometime last year, and I know that you are the first institution on the continent to actually come out with an AI institute on your campus. But just your reflections on some of the ideas that Prof. Habib has shared in fixing the economic crisis so that the reskilling crisis can be dealt with a lot more granularity.
Yes, thank you so much, Fifi. I agree with Prof. Habib. We need right people in right places. It doesn't help, to have people who are not well equipped, to handle certain portfolios and leading. This is what is troubling us. I mean, even in academia, you can be a good professor, but that doesn't automatically make one a good vice chancellor or an academic leader. But I want to go back to the earlier point that was raised by Professor Malcolm, and it ties in nicely with what Prof. Habib also raised, that where do we start? You asked the question, where do we start? There is a saying, of course, there are all these challenges and economic challenges and so on. There is a saying, and I'll put it mildly, but it says basically, if you are wet in the rain, you don't wet yourself because you are already wet. So from us here at UJ, we say, well, there are challenges around us, but what is it that we can do to contribute in our own small ways? Let's start with the schooling. I mean, when kids come to varsity, it's already late in most instances. And if they can't read, it's a challenge. But we can't chase them. We have to work with such students and try to make the best out of that. And we're trying, under trying circumstances, limited resources. But at the University of Johannesburg, I'm glad to mention that many people may not know, you can come to UJ as a small baby, grade R, and leave as a postdoctoral research fellow, because we have a school, that takes kids, from grade R. We've got a high school that works closely with the university, because we can't fold our arms and say there's a challenge. We can show that it's doable, and through that, we have available lessons. We've got techno labs where grade 6 kids, can program, can code, at our fab labs and so on. And what we learn there, we take it out through our techno labs as part of our drive to upskill teachers. We provide free robotics and coding workshops. And we started piloting this in 2021, and we have seen great success. So there are such examples that we can build on. But this is a drop, in the ocean. But we are saying this, that many should join in so that we can help as best as we can. The biggest challenge is that in our system, we specialize very early. Many of the kids, when they come to varsity, they are 16, 17. Some don't even know what they want to study. I remember when I was a student, a friend followed us around and said, "Jens, what are you studying?" We said, "Law." He said, "Oh, I'm also going to study law." Because many of our kids are first generation to come to university. They have no clue what is happening. And that can also play an important role. After 3 years, one can say, this is not what I want to do. But to answer the question asked earlier, we need flexibility in the higher education sector, which we don't have. We need to be agile enough, to respond to the changing circumstances quickly. Frankly, we are training students, kids here for jobs that may not exist. And if they specialize too soon, they may not be relevant in the labor market. And it doesn't mean we have to change all the qualifications, but we can supplement that. And I want to use UJ again as an example, where we have free online courses. Somebody who studies law can do a course in artificial intelligence in the 4th Industrial Revolution to understand, what this is all about. It's free of charge. They do it at their own pace. We have introduced a number of interesting courses, including Introduction to Sustainable Development Goals, so that our students, when they leave, our graduates, they've got a broader understanding of issues. Another big challenge, Fifi, yes, the economy is not creating job opportunities as quickly as we want, and something we need to address. But, in South Africa, we tend to graduate job seekers instead of inculcating the mindset of also graduating job creators. And it's something that we need to work on. Entrepreneurship is extremely important. Earlier this year, we launched a program at the University of Johannesburg where we use the 3D concrete printing machines to print low-cost housing. You can print a low-cost house in 8 hours. And people were saying this is going to take jobs for bricklayers. And I would say, yes, that is an opportunity to upskill people, to retrain people so they can service these machines. But the point I wanted to make, I looked at our engineering students that were working with these machines, and I was like, guys, this is an opportunity. If you master the skills to use this, you could, after graduating here at UJ, get these machines. They're expensive, yes, I know. and go and print this housing. There's such a huge need of low-cost housing. So we need to think outside of the box. Earlier on, a point was made about public-private partnerships. These are extremely important. Often the tendency is to point fingers, to say, look, the students that are graduated are not fit and so on. I say, let's work together. People talk about centers of excellence. We need more of those where we can partner with industry and make sure that our graduates have got that industry experience. Internship are extremely important. Prof. Malcolm, we did a survey at the University of Johannesburg, and we found that the students that had vacation work, that did internships, that had part-time work during their studies, of course, within reasons, they were the first to be snapped by the labor market. So work integrated learning is extremely important. Internship opportunities are extremely important, no matter how small they are, that we work together. This will require a partnership approach. Now, we are seeing serious problems with the economy and so on. And yes, a lot has to be done, and often by those that are in charge of the economy. But while pushing them and nudging them, and there's a lot of frustration there. But I say in our own small way, we are wet and we are in the rain. We should not wet ourselves because we are already wet. But at the same time, these uncomfortable truths must be said, in terms of the money that is wasted every day. Sure. That could be put to good use to train our students. And we should not be shy to call out people who are occupying positions that they're not fit for, because they frustrate those that can do the job to leave the country, to leave the sectors and so on. And where does it leave us as a country? Where does it leave us as a continent? I'll pause there, Fifi.
Okay, thank you. Allowing me to get out of the rain because it gets really cold, and of course we don't want to get the flu here. Jokes aside though, Prof. Mbedi, I think a wonderful template that you've started us off with in terms of what a really good model, a reskilling model does look like. I mean, you spoke about the complementary AI or technology offerings to traditional subjects like law, as it were. You also spoke about the integration of SDG related learning within some of these traditional subjects, and also the harnessing of the mindset of young people to think beyond just being a job seeker, but also an entrepreneur in a sense. And Dr. Haddad, I'd like to understand, I mean, if you had kids coming from UJ, trained in this manner, with this mindset, do you reckon that their absorption rate would be a lot easier for the economy? Do you reckon that there'd be more opportunities potentially that could be created for them, and that would potentially have a stop of what you had described a little earlier in a lot of students that you've seen on the continent seeking greener pastures outside of the continent because there's no home for them here?
I agree with what have been said in this panel, and also in the role of the private sector, we cannot, operate in silo. And I think where this starts, it starts at the policy level, meaning at the government level, at the vision of the country. Even though it starts at the policy level, I believe that the inclusion of the private sector, academia, civil society at that stage is crucial. Unfortunately, today's problems, they don't come packaged the way we want them to be. Most importantly, they don't come packaged by departments. And that is how our governments, our universities, and most of our businesses are structured today. So we have to understand the problem, understand the magnitude of a problem, work together. And in a way, it's not just, by creating another department for reskilling and the problem will be solved, because you need to be reskilling people at scale to increase the nation level, the national income level, to create a large middle class segment. It's not the work of governments that are fiscally distressed alone. It's not certainly the role of the private sector, because if the assumption is education is a public good, which I think it is, then the private sector that operates within this economic system, that in general it is market based. So it cannot, if you think that private sector by itself can solve this this problem of such magnitude of a public good, then I doubt it.
Sure.
Then that's why the governments, they need to own the process. They need to set the vision. They need to bring all these key stakeholders together. Let me take an example. What would like the economy, for example, in countries like DRC, Zambia, Botswana, and South Africa would look like in 10 years or 20 years? What kind of skills we want in 10 and 20 years? Do we want just to focus on being a mining economy, or we want to include our graduates and our labor force in the global value chains? And how do we create that? Can we work together that all the IPs and all the financial margin stays within the region instead of just exporting, for example, cheap raw natural resources abroad? Because by all means, the world would be happy to buy our resources, the cheap price. But this is how we should start. We start at the policy, what we want to do, and then bring all the key stakeholders together. By all means, private sector, academia, they all sit on the same table, and start working from there, build an action plan, and we start working together from that. And I want to talk about an important aspect of it later, maybe about the funding of such long-term investments in the country's human capital, which is, I think, the most important investment, because that will drive all the other key factors for social and economic development.
No, sure. The funding, a very important part of the equation. In fact, Dr. Wahi, in his opening address, made a reference of some of the funding that that process would entail, just talking about the cost of reskilling right now being within the range of around $10,000 to $20,000 per new graduate joining a company. That is not small change. And yeah, certainly ideas on how that can be funded will certainly be welcomed. We'll come back to you in just a short while. So we do have engagement from our audience members, and perhaps we take a question from them. Dr. Joy Issa, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for your question. So, respective panelists, what she's asking about is, or she's talking about, from my understanding, the concept of inclusive recruitment by universities. So it's the same conversation that we talk about in terms of the companies maybe being a little bit more lenient on certain qualifications in terms of who they hire, not by wanting a degree and all the other forms of qualifications. So what Dr. Joy is saying is that she'd like to throw a challenge to the universities here. So that's you, Dr. Mpedi, Dr. Habib, as well as Dr. McLeaver. In terms of the focus on the high stakes entrance assessments that you use that test knowledge more than skills, and so putting secondary schools under pressure also to prepare their students to pass these tests to gain entrance. Is there an opportunity for universities to do things a little bit differently here in terms of how you do construct these assessments? Prof. McLeaver, perhaps getting your thoughts on this.
I agree absolutely. I think the current entry requirements are somewhat false. They don't actually recognize or identify the potential of a student. What they do is they simply indicate how they have performed during their mainstream education pathway. They in many instances, as your viewers said, it's about the ability to pass a test. And as everybody knows, there's a big difference between knowledge and understanding. The fact that somebody is able to retain vast amounts of knowledge doesn't mean to say that they can understand it or know how to use it. And it's no indicator of their potential to engage with higher education or to develop the skills and characteristics and attributes that are required of them later on in life. I think we need to be much more flexible in terms of our entry gate. We need to look much more at the potential and the ability for people to grow and to develop. We shouldn't be looking at where they're coming from. We should be looking at where they are going to.
Okay. Prof. Habib, your take on flexibility at the entry gate, if there's an opportunity for institutions to relook at how assessment tests and all of that are conducted? Because, I mean, right now we're talking about the students who are in the school system in terms of the reskilling revolution and all that, and what's needed for career planning and all that. But there's a whole host of students who are not there, not only because they can't afford to be in varsity, but also because the entry requirements from an assessment point of view are perhaps too high. What's your take on that?
So I think we need, again, Fifi, I think we need a very, very nuanced conversation on this, because we assume that all universities do the same thing, and that's just not true. You have some universities that are research-intensive universities that are driven to focus on postgraduate studies, driven to create high-level skill sets in either the sciences or the business sciences or the social sciences. There are other institutions in other parts of the world that are liberal arts colleges. That's to give people a broad level training and to enable them to enter the job market with a set of skill sets. Now, it seems to me that the first thing we've got to understand in the South African context, for instance, what is the differential mandate? So what is the purpose of Forte? What is the purpose of Stellenbosch? What is the purpose of UJ? What is the purpose of WITS? And how do we get these universities to speak to their different mandates? When you get that happening, then you say, what is the appropriate access entry requirements? And there, I think Malcolm is right. It's not simply about testing somebody. It's about getting their experience. It's looking at the collective skill sets that they bring. But what you don't want to do is send somebody to engineering in University of Johannesburg who has not done mathematics, because then that puts them at a disadvantage. And so, yes, to being flexible, but we need an incredibly nuanced conversation around this. And then I want to come back to what I originally said. When we're looking at the technical colleges, the entry requirements for the technical colleges should be very, very different from what we expect to be happening at the university system. And so I'm suggesting a more nuanced conversation about the entry requirements for technical colleges, the entry requirements for undergraduate teaching colleges, the entry requirements for postgraduate teaching institutions, and the entry requirements for comprehensive. And how do we make all of this speak to each other? And this ultimately brings back to the importance of policy. You can't do a differential mandate. You can't think through how do you get all of these institutions to do different things unless you have skill sets at the apex of government who understand what is required, who are able to steward the institutions to achieve their respective mandates, and most importantly, to deploy the collective resources for the achievement of this end. I remind you, our NISFA's budget has gone up 800% in 10 years. Are we any better off to what we were? I ask you that we take what now is between 1 and 2% skills levy from every employment, every company in this country, which translates into billions. Are we using that money enough? And unless we deal with that question, we're in trouble. Letlokwa is right. You can do fantastic things at UJ, and UJ has been fantastic, as has UP, as has WITS, as have been many people. But the trick about fixing the systemic challenges is going to scale. And going to scale requires spending money, the hundreds of billions that we spend, to be spent properly. Otherwise, we don't reach scale. And if we don't reach scale, we don't deal with the unemployment crisis. And as importantly, we don't deal with the skills crisis that we confront as a nation in South Africa. But I think that all of this applies to the continent as a whole.
Okay. Prof. Habib, your point on throwing money as, or putting money, foregrounding money as a solution is well noted, just given the reference you did make to the scheme here in South Africa that does help students who are not able to afford the full university criteria, up 800% in the last 10 years. And the question you asked, are we any better off? Very noted. And we'll get to that in just a short while, because while money is not the only solution, it's certainly part of it as it does pertain to reskilling. Prof. Mbedi, I heard you nodding in agreement with the response that Prof. Habib gave in terms of the entry requirements at school level being nuanced and the respective mandates of the institutions. Do you have anything to add on this before we do move on to the cost of reskilling?
Yes, I would like to add something extremely important. I would say it's not just about the entrance assessment, because if you look at the higher education sector in South Africa, just UJ, for this academic year, we received over 350,000 applications for 10,400 seats. You need some form of, a fair and objective criteria, to determine who comes and study with you. The sad thing is that many students who meet our minimum requirements and some exceeding them could not be accommodated. Now, this raises the question, and something that we've been seeing here in South Africa, that the perception is that you have to go to varsity to become somebody. And that has to change. We need to strengthen our technical colleges, TVET colleges, and something is being done there. And hopefully we'll see results soon. We need colleges, that would impart, skills. We need more artisans than everybody aspiring to wear a tie and a suit. And that is where the problem is. We need to address that problem, that the university is not the only answer to becoming somebody, or gaining access to the labor market. Let me pause there.
Okay. Let me continue. So a point wonderfully made, and I think that for us to change the idea and perception that a university degree is the be-all and end-all, it also does require the private sector to change its criteria for who it hires and who it doesn't, because many people will tell you that, you look at the job spec of certain careers and it lists all these degrees and post degrees and all that you need, and that perhaps is also what is motivating this importance of having a degree as opposed to going to a TVET college. I do believe that this is a conversation that will be handled later on in the day, and I am looking forward to hearing what those speakers have to say. But Dr. Hara, if we are prepared to wrap up the conversation, we're talking about the cost of reskilling. You wanted to talk about this. How much do you see this costing? I know that you can't give us a ballpoint figure. How much do you see it costing, and who foots the bill?
Yes, before we assess the costing, let's talk about the financial situation on the African continent. And I want to follow up on Professor Habib's points. That is, if we want to achieve social and economic development, we have to reskill at scale. And that means it's a big investment. And like any other investment, big part of it, among all the resources it requires capital and funding. For example, 65% of the annual global spending on education is spent in the developed countries. And please note that only 0.5% of that is spent in low-income countries. And almost half of the African countries, 20 over 54 African countries, are categorized low-income. It means that there is a high correlation and also causality, as research suggests, between funding education and achieving a nation's development, at least in the economic terms. So now, considering education is, when we talk about education, automatically we think about the government's role in it, because we think that education is a public good. The problem in Africa is that governments are fiscally distressed. The public money is scarce and expensive. African countries, they borrow money at very exceptionally high interest, and they can very often borrow only on short maturities, if at all, because we are considered by the international lenders and international financial and capital markets as high-risk territories. Sometimes they overly estimated us as high-risk territories, and that makes this is on one hand. On the other hand, we need to think of education and reskilling as long-term investment, and that needs a lot of resources. Now, a second source of funding can be the international public finance, like from multilateral and bilateral institutions like the World Bank and the EBRD and the Agence Française de Développement and the German KfW and so on and so forth. But these borrowings also, they come at a price, at a high price, because these institutions, they will continue doing of what they have been doing. It's not, meaning projecting solutions that may or may not fit in our African context. And we cannot just take solutions from these institutions like that, from these institutions that we have little say in their boardrooms and in their ownership structures. The solution has to be homegrown, has to be ground-based.
All right.
We may or we may not need 12-year-long curricula. This is, again, to join the point of Professor Mpedi. So we have to have that flexibility, and according to our context, we develop and we design our solutions and our policies. Right. Now, coming to the private sector, that is also another source of funding. And the reality of things is that with this economic system, the bulk of the money is at the hand of the private sector, whether it is, domestically or internationally sourced. But in general, this money is not channeled to, let's say, projects that are beneficial for the society as a whole. And this is for many reasons. Okay. One, because the private sector, its main focus is profit generating as quickly as possible for its shareholders. Now we can, of course, there is a big debate about we think about the stakeholders as a whole, the society, but the reality is the main focus of the private sector is making money as soon as possible. And second, and this is through the work I did in Africa, there is a massive amount of money that is available, for example, in hedge funds, in insurance companies, and pension funds, and such of, the likes of institutional investors. And they are willing to invest that money in projects that are, doing what we say blended finance and, like co-finance projects with the public sector. But the problem here is that there are no financial platforms or financial instruments to bring the public money and the private money together, or co-finance or do blended finance. And this is a big gap again, because the structure of our economy did not create new instruments, did not create a new or depth in our economy, so there is a lack of well-structured, bankable project with long-term vision that the private sector also can have visibility on it and can minimize its risk by getting involved in that. And this brings us to the problem or the side of the deployment of resources. Okay. The fact that we said that these resources are very rare, very expensive, and yet we are deploying them in a very inefficient manner. And this created just, a vicious cycle of not finding cheap money and deploying it in a very inefficient way.
I think to the point that Prof. Habib was trying to share in the reference that he made on the increase in finance that had been allocated to a certain sector in South Africa's education system, but the lack of results that had been yielded from that investment. Also speaking to the importance of policy, I suppose, in ensuring that the funding that is required is coordinated in a manner that is a lot more proficient, and that there's greater accountability in how that money is spent. So unfortunately, as Prof. Mbedi has been doing throughout the discussion, I'm going to have to pause here. But I do know that we have a whole day of class, and all these issues will be debated in further detail, no doubt, as well as a whole host of other ideas that my fellow colleagues will be discussing. But to all of you, thanks so much for your time. Of course, I was in conversation with Prof. Malcolm McLeaver, the CEO at TAG West Africa, the University of Lancaster, Ghana. Prof. Adam Habib, Director at SOAS University over in London. Prof. Letlhokwa Mpedi, the Vice Chancellor and Principal University, and Principal rather, at the University of Johannesburg, as well as Dr. Marwa Hada, Vice President for Finance and Strategy at Blue Monsoon Capital.